appointees out there to deal with it. And two, it gives you a list of things to look at to start being proactive about making sure that you don't have these things happen, that you are protecting the children, that you have your legal property documents in order, that you have a safe facility that people aren't likely to hurt themselves on, or if they do trip, that they can be proven that it wasn't your fault because you did go out of your way to make sure that your property was safe, that you have proper insurance. So start by being proactive on those 5. And if you find yourself in any difficulty in those, Church Law and Tax would be a great place to go to start to get some help on that. But I think just about everybody listening is going to go, yeah, at least one of those feels far too familiar to them.
And just to add to that for a second, it's also one of those moments when you're a church leader and you have only a limited amount of time and resources. You sit down and you say, well, how do we avoid getting sued? Well, you go in any number of directions and the possibilities seem limitless. And what this list does is it helps narrow the conversation so that if you say, well, if we only have so much time and energy and resources, can we at least do something in each of these 5 areas as acts of prevention? And that's going to make a wonderful difference as far as positioning your church to avoid future problems.
Yeah, if you take care of those 5 things, you reduce the likelihood of being sued, not to 0, that will never happen, but you reduce it about as substantially as you're going to be capable of, probably, if you deal with those 5 well. Yeah. And now a 20-second break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are 2 things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a Patreon partner. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of ministries that need it the most. Our Patreon link is in the show notes.
This episode is brought to you by the Truce Podcast. I'm sure you've been there. You're at an event, a dinner, a small group, and someone says something like,
"If you're a Christian, you have to vote Republican."
Huh. That raises an interesting question. How did evangelicals like me get to the place where we just assumed we'd all vote one way? This season on the Truce Podcast, we're diving deep into the complexity of the 1970s and 80s to understand how evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party. It's a story that involves murder, corruption, redemption, and our need to be heard. I'll be talking with celebrated historians like Rick Perlstein, Pulitzer Prize winners Francis Fitzgerald and Jesse Eisinger, and some of the best guests I've ever had. Truce is the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. Subscribe to Truce anywhere you get podcasts or listen at trucepodcast.com.
All right, let's move from that to another topic of conversation that comes up with Church Law and Tax an awful lot when pastors are talking to each other, and that's the clergy housing allowance. There's always conversation about it. I'm always hearing in the news something's about to change, or maybe something has changed and it turns out it hasn't. So I want to come straight to the folks who know about it. Where are we with housing allowance right now, and is there any way to predict where it might go in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been something that has been and first of all, just as a starting point, the clergy housing allowance for your listeners, if they aren't already aware, it's probably one of the most beneficial tax benefits that ministers can receive, and it costs churches nothing. It is a way to help your minister as far as their living expenses, their housing expenses in particular. And you don't have to spend additional monies out of the church budget to make that available to them. And so we point that out because too often churches overlook this or don't think through it. It's really on the pastor to request it, but it's on the church to help ensure that it gets set. And, through that conversation, doing this, pursuing it can make a big difference as far as a minister's livelihood when we know that resources are already very, very limited. And so compensation packages are oftentimes not where we'd like them to be. And this benefit is there as a way to at least provide some reprieve. Unfortunately, it's been challenged legally quite a bit over the last 10, 12 years in particular. There is an organization by the name of the Freedom from Religion Foundation that has challenged it on constitutional grounds a number of times. And its most recent challenge got defeated in 2019, which is great news for churches and for ministers. Essentially, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals came out and said, no, the clergy housing allowance is constitutional, it is permissible. It doesn't violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And therefore, we see it as being something that churches should be able to offer to the ministers in the same way that many other professions outside of ministry provide to their employees for similar reasons. And so that's great news. It's legal, it's constitutional, it's available. There's really no sign at this point of any legal challenge being brought against it. We'll, of course, continue to monitor that and update people if we do learn of that kind of situation. But over the last 2 years or so, we just haven't seen anything surface that would suggest that it's in any way, shape, or form in jeopardy.
Okay, well, that's great news. And just as a quick shorthand for those who may not be aware what that is, it really is simply whatever the church is paying to the pastor, you can redirect a percentage of that, and sometimes the entire thing, depending on how much, towards whatever the pastor is actually paying for their housing costs, from the rent or mortgage on their home to their electrical bill and so on. And it comes to them as tax-free income rather than taxable income. So it's literally just a change in the categorization of how the pastor is paid. So it costs neither party anything, but it saves the pastor quite often significant amounts on tax. And as you said, that's very helpful because the average pastor is paid far less than other people, given our experience, our expertise, and our educational background. I think we are consistently the lowest paid professionals out there, which no complaints here at all. We know what we're getting into when we get into it. Very few pastors, if any, get into it for the money, despite what the headlines look like. So that's what exactly that's about. Right. Yeah.
We do have in our annual church and clergy tax guide, I believe it's in chapter 6, we provide a lot of additional specific information about how someone qualifies to receive the housing allowance, how you set that housing allowance, and some other parameters that you want to make sure you follow. And so, but your description here is correct. It is a benefit that's available widely for most ministers and should be taken advantage of.
Yeah. All right, let's go to where we're all still in the middle of now, and it looks like we'll still be somewhat in the middle of for a while, the pandemic, whether places are in lockdowns or not, whether people have started to worship in person or not. There are a lot of legal issues around that. What are some of the key legal issues that you're hearing from churches about ministry during pandemic, and how do we respond to them?
The evolution of this topic is really pretty fascinating. We started out the pandemic and it was about, well, can we meet? Can we even convene together? Can we gather together? How can we do online ministry? How do we figure out ways to still serve and minister in the midst of the crisis? And then we started meeting again in some way. Then it was about masks and safety precautions, health precautions. Now, obviously, we've moved into the territory related to vaccinations and some of those conversations. What I would like to focus on here is just trying to emphasize a couple of key things for your listeners, which is one, that in-person ministry can and should be happening. It's not a matter now so much of whether we should be coming together. We do see that is permissible and over the vast majority of the country. And so, but with that in mind, there should really be still an awareness and a recognition of what your local and state and even federal municipalities are having to say about what those gatherings should look like. There are some places that have requirements related to masks or distancing or other protocols. We think those should be taken seriously. We think that leaders should be, listening to those kinds of guidelines and figuring out ways to implement those in a reasonable way with their ministries. And in large part, and from a legal perspective, it's because you don't want to have a situation arise later where an outbreak occurs in your congregation, a number of people become ill, the unthinkable happens, maybe someone dies, and then you face this possibility of someone saying, well, but for your church meeting and breaking regulations that were recommended by your local municipalities, this person wouldn't have gotten sick and died. And so by recognizing those recommendations or that guidance and adhering to those as best as you can, it does really help your church minimize the legal risks that are involved, but it also ensures what we think are good practices as far as keeping people healthy, keeping people safe, and ultimately doing what we all want to do, which is to be together again.
Okay. Let's talk about another issue that's probably far more in the headlines than it is in actual reality. At least I certainly hope so, which is financial misconduct within the church. There was a theft, or there was an embezzlement, or there was the accusation of an embezzlement. One of the first lessons I learned as an early pastor was don't touch the finances. And anybody who does physically have to handle the money, there should always be two people there with the cash, with the checks. There should always be proper systems in place overseeing that, so that if an accusation of fraud or theft or embezzlement is made, you can prove a line that shows it, that it wasn't there, and it protects people from that actually happening by nobody being alone with the finances. But what's happening in that area? What can you help us out with to protect ourselves, to show that truly innocent people are innocent, and then to follow up if some fraud has occurred?
Well, and the way you frame that at the end of your question, I think is really important. What we try to stress at Church Law and Tax, and what the CPAs and other individuals that work with us really try to impress upon church leaders on a continual basis is, when you put internal controls into place within your congregations, it's not because you are trying to be paranoid. It's not because you're trying to be distrustful of those who are leading or serving. It's really designed to protect the church, and it's designed to protect the individual. Because to your point, sometimes something can happen. It could just be a very honest error that occurs, and we don't want that person to suddenly be cast into a light that subjects them to unnecessary or unfair scrutiny. And internal controls can have that ability to help prevent that from ever even arising.
Or even in a situation where, let's say you've got somebody who is a trusted member of the church, but they've fallen into some financial difficulty that surprises them. You don't want to put them in a position where there's even the ability for them to pull 100 off the top and thinking, I'm going to put it back in next week. And this is a person who normally wouldn't do it if the opportunity wasn't presented. Let's make sure that nobody is ever presented with the opportunity for that temptation to become real in their life.
That's an excellent point. It's something that comes up in some work that we've actually recently done on this topic. So we did a survey, a nationwide survey back in the spring of 2021, and we ended up getting responses from more than 700 church leaders. And among those church leaders, about a third said that they had been a part of a congregation that had experienced some kind of financial misconduct at some point in the past. Wow. And among that group, half of them said it happened within the last 10 years. Those statistics are eye-opening for a few different reasons. One is because as we've looked at this topic, and as I in particular have looked at this topic over the last 15 years, the figure tends to run more in the 10 to 15% range when someone is asked, has your church dealt with this? So to see it more in the 30% range was really startling for both me and for those that were involved with this project. And along with that, as you would talk with people with these other surveys in the past, there was always this sense that, 10 to 15% seems really low. It doesn't sound quite like what we think it might actually be. And so this survey almost sort of confirmed for the first time, at least for us, that it is more prevalent than we would expect. And sadly, as our results also showed, there's really no pattern as far as the churches that are susceptible. It can be a church really of any size, any setting, any location. So from some of your smallest churches to some of your largest. And in the instance where a church has experienced this, the primary reasons why it occurred, according to our respondents at least, was one, we didn't have the internal controls in place that we probably should have had. And two, we didn't have the internal controls in place because we never thought it could happen to us. And in fact, we know Joe and we trust Joe, and there's no reason for us. We're a really small congregation. We don't think that Joe would ever do something like this. Well, you don't have the internal controls in place. And as you point out, Carl, there's some kind of financial crisis that Joe encounters. He has an opportunity alone with the collections one Sunday morning. There's no one around. There's no internal control in place for that. That's a temptation. That's a hard temptation. And so one of the CPAs that advised our project, Nathan Salisbury from Cape and Krause, he made the comment, these internal controls are designed to help minimize that temptation because we're all susceptible to temptation of one form or another at one point or another. And these systems are designed to try and mitigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. It protects everybody. It protects the giver, it protects the church, it protects the people who are counting it. It protects the person who might be in a difficult financial situation from having a temptation that would be hard to overcome. And even if you don't discover it, then you've got somebody who pulled $10 off the top of the offering and has got that sin sitting on their heart right now that they could not have committed if we had just simply put proper checks in place to protect them in their moment of weakness. So all of that together is very helpful to do. And before we start to round this up again, let's take the shift over to specifically the small church. Obviously, everything so far is applicable in churches of all sizes. But let's just get to one question about the specifically small congregation. If you're in a small church and you simply, your budget is either tight or non-existent for finding legal aid when you need it, what are some options for small congregations that simply can't afford the kind of high-priced attorney that we've got in our head that we just think is going to start costing us a couple $100 an hour?
It's a great question. And really what we have encountered with church law and tax over the years, and really one of the primary reasons why we exist as a not-for-profit ministry is we're trying to help small and mid-sized churches in particular navigate a lot of these issues, knowing that they can't go out and hire the legal expertise to do it.
Yeah.
Now that takes you only so far. You can do good systems, good processes. You can put some preventive measures in place. You can do a lot of training. And in fact, I think that's the first answer to your question, which is when you engage in those kinds of activities, you will start to reduce some of the costs that you would have to incur if you were to go out and seek legal counsel. And so an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Is that the saying? Yeah. I think that's probably very true in this instance. We would advocate for that. And so our resources, our materials are really designed with that in mind to help educate and prepare churches and help them train and equip those who are leading. So that's really kind of a starting point. I think a couple of other thoughts come to mind. One is invariably at some point or another, and really in any church's life, it's going to encounter something that probably requires some legal help, some kind of assistance from an attorney. And there are some different ways that you can go about that. You can tap into networks. You probably have someone on your board. They might be an attorney, maybe someone in your congregation. And that's okay. But we would be cautious in advising that for a couple of reasons. One is because those individuals may not be very well versed in church legal issues. They may specialize in some form of law that is completely removed and different from church legal issues. So don't just assume that because a person is an attorney, they're going to know how to handle a specific issue or question. But tap into those individuals for a couple of reasons. One, they might know others in your community who are equipped to do that. And they can also at least help you start to get a little bit of an understanding of the size and scope and magnitude of the issue and whether or not it is really important for you to seek out additional counsel. If you do find that you need counsel, you can have a consultation with an attorney up front, and you can ensure that when you talk to that attorney, you understand what their fee structures are, how the attorney is going to get paid, some of those kinds of things up front. And you can also communicate, we're a small church, we're on a very limited budget. So as a result, we're going to be limited in what we can do. And sometimes the attorney, knowing that, has the ability to sit with you and say, okay, well, if that's the case, let's prioritize the work that we're going to do. And maybe we knock out a couple of the really big and important things up front. Some of these other things maybe could be set aside and come back to later when more budget or more resources are available to handle those items. So it gives a better sense of prioritization that can make it a little bit more palatable as far as the costs are concerned.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, an ounce of prevention, the least expensive legal advice you can give anybody is preventative. Whatever money it takes you or time it takes you up front to spend that time or money preventing any of these things from taking place. First of all, it means less damage being done to people, which is the most important thing. But secondly, from a legal standpoint, it also protects you from all of this. And from a financial standpoint, it is going to be far cheaper to pay for the prevention up front than to pay a penalty later for not having prevented it.
That is true in so many different ways. Examples that come to mind immediately. If you write a really effective policy, let's say on child abuse prevention, you have an attorney helping with that and getting that set, and then working on the policy implementation and the training that comes with it. That could prevent an abuse claim later that could, run into catastrophic amounts of money.
Yeah, it can actually do a couple of things. One, it can hopefully prevent the abuse at all. Secondly, if there's an allegation made and there is no abuse, because that does happen, it's a small percentage, but there are some abuse allegations that are made that are without basis, it can protect you there as well, because you can show how these things were put in place. And if you've got a camera, for instance, showing that time, that place, and nothing occurs, you can protect people. And then thirdly, if, God forbid, some horrifying thing does happen, It helps you to respond in the correct way, to help, first of all, the victims, and secondly, to make sure that the church makes it through properly.
One other thing I'll just mention briefly here, there are some options at times for churches to tap into where they can find legal aid that's at low cost or no cost. And I would just make mention here of the Christian Legal Society. That's an organization that I'm a member of as an attorney myself, and know many other attorneys who are members of. And they run Christian legal aid clinics all over the country. They also have directories of attorneys that are located throughout the country, and you can contact those attorneys. May not always be able to do low cost or no cost, but in certain instances that may be possible. And so, look into that as a possibility too, if you're in need of legal assistance and knowing that you're limited in the resources that you have to use as far as addressing it.
Yeah. And a couple of reasons to go to things like Christian Legal Society and Church Law and Tax, to places that specialize in church law. First of all, the law and finances are very, very, very complex. Just like when you go to a doctor, you've got your general practitioner, but then you're going to go to a specialist if things get challenging. And there are so many different specializations. So people who specialize in the church are going to have an understanding of it that somebody who isn't specializing in church isn't going to have. And then secondly, it's kind of the mass production thing too. If you've got a group that is doing this kind of work regularly, it's like they've got a template set up for it. They're likely to be able to do it cheaper because they're not going to have to put in the research, because the research has already been done. They already know what they're doing. So you're capitalizing on their expertise, even in the financial payout, is my guess, at least, hopefully. All right, we're going to move from that to the lightning round questions and see how you match up against these. All right, are you ready, Matt?
I am ready.
All right. What are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to it?
Yeah, so I started out in my career as a print journalist, especially in the last few years, being church law and tax, doing work, helping churches with information they need, the resources they need. We've seen a dramatic shift as far as how people get their information. So we used to print 2 newsletters. We don't print those anymore. We do everything through our website. And we've also, we've done a lot more as far as offering webinars, events that can help people attend and learn through a virtual setting. And we're increasingly doing more video and multimedia now. We've got a new podcast we just released called the Church Law Podcast. We just done a project related to that law I mentioned earlier, the religious land use law. We've got a virtual roundtable that we've just done on that subject. And it's all with this idea in mind that people now are used to getting their information through video, through interactive types of situations. And so just printing something out and expecting people to read it is just not the name of the game anymore. It has its place, but it's one thing among many rather than being the only thing.
Yeah, and you folks at Church Law and Tax have really jumped on that really well. You do the online teaching quite well, whether it's live webinars or things that you can watch later, or the live webinar that you can watch later. In fact, I'm on the advisory team with you, and you and I have never been physically in the same room together, and yet we hang out and chat like we know each other because every meeting has been online. So you guys have adapted to that very, very well. All right, second question. What free resource like an app or a website has helped you lately that you would recommend for small church ministry?
Yeah, this is a tool that I came across about 4 years ago when I was in law school. And what I was finding, and I don't know if your listeners will relate to this or not, but I'm a lists guy. I like making lists and knowing what I need to get done and checking those things off as I get them done. And I used to do that manually. I used to write out my list. I thought that was a really good way to kind of make sure that I could know what I was working on and prioritize. And of course, as you know, your list changes by the minute. And so doing that manually became really, really clunky. And I came across a site that has an app that's associated with it that's called Workflowy. And it has been just a game changer for me as far as keeping lists, keeping multiple lists so I can keep track of things going on various fronts with work and with projects. It syncs very seamlessly with my app on my phone. And it's just been a real productivity boost for me. And the great thing is, if you don't want to spend the money on the monthly subscription, and I don't think it's too costly, but if you wanted to just use the free version, you can do that. You just are limited in the number of lists that you can make. But, if that's all you need, it can prove to be very useful and it's free.
Great. I assume that's just Workflow with an I tacked onto the end?
Actually, with
a
Y.
I mean, yeah,
yes.
With a Y tacked onto the end.
That's
I
right.
said I was thinking Y, and I said I, and I don't know why. All righty. Question number 3. What's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
Well, I thought about this for a while, and it was a little intimidating because I'm thinking,
Yeah.
I'm probably getting this. I'm probably looking to you and to the people that listen to this podcast for this kind of guidance. So I don't know if what I'm going to have to share is going to be valuable or not, but this is something that came up, with church law and tax. We get a ton of questions daily from readers all over the country. Even people that aren't members of our website contact us looking for help and assistance. And at the time, I was reporting to our editor, Marshall Shelley. That's a name that you and others may recognize. He was for a long time the editor of Leadership Journal and just a wonderful mentor and friend. And I was explaining to him how hard it is getting all these questions and not being able to answer all of them. And Marshall said, I always look to some words of wisdom that I think Pastor Andy Stanley had shared at one time, which is each day do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. And while I don't necessarily just limit it to one each day, I do try to keep in mind I can only do so much. And so if I only answer 1 or 2 questions for readers and I have to let others go, at least I was doing something as far as being helpful and responsive rather than nothing, which is what we might resort to if we feel paralyzed by the volume that we face.
Yeah. A wonderful, encouraging reminder, especially for those who are in small congregations, because sometimes we feel like we're not doing enough for enough people, but just deal with the folks God gave you and do what you can that day and leave the rest of it in the Lord's hands. That's great ministry advice. And then the final one, what is the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
Again, a little intimidating. And I don't want to sound too critical, too negative. So I thought about this for a while. So I grew up basically from the age of 4 on. I grew up in the Evangelical Covenant Church. I'm a native of Denver, grew up in one of the suburbs there, went to a Covenant church there and was confirmed there. And I distinctly remember in high school in a worship service, our senior pastor at the time, man that I love and respect and just have a great deal of admiration for. In fact, he was the person that introduced me to CT when he knew I was interested in journalism. One Sunday morning during the worship services, he invited a gentleman to come up and give a testimonial. And I think the lesson out of this is make sure you know what this person's going to share as a part of their testimonial. So he stands in front of the congregation and proceeds to share, and I think he was in his 20s at the time. He proceeds to share the ugly and painful details of a breakup with a woman that also attends that church.
Oh, no.
And I distinctly remember sitting and just squirming in my seat because it was so uncomfortable and awkward, realizing that not only do you feel badly for this person who's sharing these details, but you feel just as badly for the person sitting in the service hearing these details being relayed. And of course, no names are shared as a part of this, but everyone just already knows who this person is referencing. And so I came away from that realizing if you're going to have someone speak in front of the church during worship service, make sure you know what they're going to say and how that's going to play out.
Yeah. We've learned that recently for the testimonials to make sure we hear in advance. In fact, for those who are nervous, we actually give them like a dress rehearsal. Well, not a full dress rehearsal, but we give them a rehearsal in advance. Tell me the whole story. Then we give them a little take this in, take this out. I know there's a lot of churches that are a lot more freewheeling than that, but that's where our fun stories come from, I guess. All right. So much good stuff. How can people find you online if they need to follow up on anything, Matt?
Churchlawandtax.com is our main website. We also have an online store that carries our print and digital resources. That's churchlawandtaxstore.com. You can also, when you go to the website, there's material available that's free. There's a lot of material that you have to be a member to access, but you can also sign up for our free e-newsletters. Those are designed to keep you informed and updated and introduce you to the different things that we do. And certainly, of course, we hope that if you're not already a member, you'll at some point consider becoming one.
Yeah, I fully encourage all our listeners to do that. I regularly unsubscribe to all kinds of email lists that I found myself on for reasons that I don't know how I got on them. So there may be, I think there's less than half a dozen that I have remained subscribed to, and Church Law and Tax is one of them. Just there's so much information. It is so relevant to what happens. You can guarantee that if a church or tax issue comes up that relates to the church, that if a law or tax issue that relates to the church comes up, they will be among the first out there with it, and their information will be credible and helpful every single time. So, Matt, thank you so much for the work you do and for being with us today.
Well, Pastor Carl, thank you for the opportunity. We love the church. We love small churches. I'm a small church guy myself. It's a real privilege to be with you and to have the opportunity to speak with your audience, and just know that we're in your corner. We're rooting for you all.
Thank you. Well, that was one of those conversations where we had to work very hard not to go into so many areas that could have proven very helpful to our churches, but to be able to cover things that are applicable to just about everybody in some